Ethan had grown used to the monotony of the night shift at the small gas station on the edge of town. The hours dragged on, customers came in sparingly, and the only consistent noise was the flickering buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. It wasn't exciting, but it was predictable, and that's what Ethan liked about it. But tonight, something felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, the silence sharper. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. It clung to him like a shadow, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore as the night wore on. A faint beeping from the back broke the spell. Ethan frowned, glancing at the monitor above the counter. The walk-in freezer's temperature had dropped sharply, far below normal. "Not again," he muttered, grabbing his jacket. The freezer was temperamental, and he'd had to reset the thermostat more times than he could count. As he headed toward the back of the store, the dim aisles of chips and candy bars seemed unusually still. The slushy machine hummed softly, but its glow felt faint, like a dying ember in the darkness. The freezer door stood slightly ajar. A thin mist of cold vapor curled into the air, dissipating near Ethan's boots. "Figures," Ethan said under his breath, nudging the door open with his shoulder. The freezer's fluorescent lights buzzed as he stepped inside. Rows of frozen meats, boxed pizzas, and ice cream tubs gleamed under the cold white glow. Everything looked normal, except for one detail. Near the middle of the floor, a single set of footprints disturbed the frost. The prints were deep, fresh, and led to the far corner before abruptly stopping. Ethan's pulse quickened. He crouched, running his fingers across the icy indentations. The size was wrong, too large to be his own, and the spacing was strange, as if whoever made them had taken impossibly long strides. Standing quickly, Ethan tried to laugh it off. "Get it together, man. It's probably, I don't know, condensation or something." He turned to the thermostat and adjusted the dial, his breath misting in the freezing air. His fingers trembled slightly as he worked, though he told himself it was just the cold. The door slammed shut behind him. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Ethan spun around, his heart hammering. He lunged for the handle and yanked, but it didn't budge. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice echoing against the metal walls. "Who's out there?" For a moment, silence. Then he heard it, a faint, deliberate scratching from outside the door. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he leaned closer to the frosted glass panel. Something moved beyond it, a shadow shifting in the dim light of the store. A figure emerged, tall and impossibly thin, with elongated arms that hung like pendulums at its sides. Its head tilted to one side, its silhouette pressing closer to the glass. Ethan's stomach twisted as he noticed its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should have been, there was only a blurred, frost-covered void. "Hey! Let me out!" Ethan shouted, pounding on the door. His voice cracked, desperation bleeding into every word. The figure didn't move, it only stared, its tilted head following Ethan's every motion. Ethan fumbled for his phone, his shaking hands barely managing to unlock it. He dialed 911, his thumb slipping on the screen as he tried to hit call. Before he could connect, the freezer lights flickered, and then they went out. The darkness was suffocating. Ethan's phone cast a faint, blue glow, barely enough to see his own trembling hands. He could feel the cold sinking deeper into his bones, but there was something else now. A presence. The scratching sound returned, louder and closer. Then came the voice, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You shouldn't have come in here." Ethan's scream filled the small space, his voice breaking as he slammed his fists against the door. The cold air felt alive, pressing against him, freezing him in place. The handle suddenly gave way, and Ethan stumbled out, collapsing onto the cold tile floor. The store was empty, silent. He staggered to his feet, his breath heaving in his chest. He grabbed his phone and bolted for the front door, not daring to look back. As he fumbled with his keys, he caught something in his peripheral vision. a flicker on the security monitor. On the screen, the freezer door stood open. Inside, a shadow moved. It shifted toward the glass, where 3 jagged words appeared in frost. Still watching. Ethan didn't wait. He ran. Carl had worked as a night janitor for over 20 years, but no building unsettled him like the old St. Michael's Hospital. Shuttered for a decade, it loomed in the center of town, its darkened windows staring like empty sockets. Some parts of the hospital were still used for storage, but most of it was sealed off, left to rot. Carl didn't mind the isolation. In fact, he liked the quiet. It gave him time to think as he pushed his mop through the endless halls. But there was one place he refused to go, the 13th floor. Officially, it didn't exist. St. Michael's blueprint skipped from the 12th to the 14th floor, likely to appease superstitious patients. But Carl knew better. He'd heard the whispers among the older staff. Somewhere, hidden in the labyrinth of the hospital, there was a forgotten space, a floor that wasn't supposed to be there. It was just a story. At least that's what Carl told himself. The shift started like any other. Carl swept the lobby, his broom scraping against the cracked marble floors. Outside, a storm raged, and rain lashed against the tall windows in frantic bursts. As he rounded the corner near the elevators, he stopped short. One of the elevator panels was glowing. Carl frowned. The elevator hadn't worked in years, its system long since disconnected. Yet the panel blinked faintly, its light feeble but unmistakable. He stepped closer, the glow illuminating the button for the 13th floor. His mouth went dry. That button wasn't supposed to exist. For a long moment, Carl stared at it, his pulse quickening. Finally shaking his head, he muttered, "Not tonight," and turned to leave. Behind him, the elevator doors slid open with a low groan. Carl froze. Slowly, he turned back. The elevator waited, its fluorescent bulb flickering weakly. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the sour smell of mildew. His legs felt like they moved on their own as he stepped inside. The doors closed behind him with a soft thunk. The control panel glowed faintly. His finger hovered over the buttons, hesitating. Before he could decide, the elevator jolted, lurching upward. Carl stumbled, gripping the handrail as the numbers above the door ticked by, 10, 11, 12. The elevator shuddered to a stop. The panel read 13. The doors creaked open. A dark hallway stretched before him, damp and decaying. The walls were lined with peeling floral wallpaper, sagging with moisture. The air was thick and metallic, carrying a faint undercurrent of rot. Carl stepped out cautiously, his boots squelching on the sodden carpet. A faint hum buzzed in the distance, rhythmic and uneven. He thought he heard a whisper, faint but insistent, like someone just out of sight. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. Silence. He took another step, his heartbeat loud in his ears. That's when he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like fingernails drumming against glass. Carl turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hallway stood a figure. It was shadowy and indistinct, its shape eerily similar to Carl's own. The figure didn't move, but Carl could feel its presence, its gaze heavy and unnatural. The tapping stopped. "Who's there?" Carl whispered, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. The figure tilted its head, mirroring Carl's movement. Slowly, it raised an arm, pointing toward a door to Carl's left. Carl hesitated. His entire body screamed for him to turn and run, but his legs refused to obey. He moved toward the door, as though pulled by an unseen force. The door was ajar. Through the gap, a flicker of dim light spilled into the hallway. Carl pushed it open, revealing a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in deep scratches, as though something had clawed at them for years. In the center of the room sat a single chair, facing a cracked mirror. That's when Carl heard it, his own voice. "Why did you come here?" The whisper echoed, cold and sharp. Carl's breath caught. He turned to the mirror, his reflection staring back, but the chair in the reflection was empty. Then, in the mirror's distorted glass, he saw it. Behind him stood the figure. Its face was a blurred void, yet Carl could feel it grinning. It leaned close, its breath cold against his neck. "You shouldn't have come here." Carl screamed, stumbling backward. The door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. When Carl woke, he was lying on the lobby floor. The storm outside had calmed, the rain now a soft patter against the windows. Disoriented, he staggered to his feet. His mop lay nearby, and the elevator doors were open, revealing only the dark, empty shaft. He never spoke of what happened that night, but every now and then, while cleaning the 12th floor, he could hear it. The faint, rhythmic tapping. And sometimes, when passing the elevator, he swore he saw the button for the 13th floor glowing faintly. Waiting. Tyler didn't mind the isolation of working as a night security guard at the remote logistics warehouse. It was quiet, predictable, and far from the chaos of his old job in the city. The warehouse sat at the edge of a sprawling forest, miles from the nearest town. Most nights were uneventful. Tyler would sip his coffee, monitor the dimly glowing security screens, and occasionally patrol the vast lot that surrounded the warehouse. But the forest always made him uneasy. There were rumors about those woods. Truck drivers passing through told stories of strange shapes moving between the trees, of hunters who went in and never came back. Tyler dismissed it as small-town superstition, but some nights when the wind howled through the trees, he'd find himself watching the tree line a little too long. The night began like any other. Tyler sat in his cramped office, the rhythmic hum of the monitors filling the air. Outside, a storm was brewing, the wind rattling the window above his desk. As he leaned back in his chair, sipping lukewarm coffee, the motion detector alarm chimed softly. He frowned and glanced at the monitors. Camera 7, which covered the lot's back corner near the forest, showed movement. The image was grainy, but there was something there. A tall, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the woods. Its silhouette was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its stance slightly off balance. Tyler squinted at the screen. What the hell? Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped outside. The cold night air hit him like a slap, carrying the earthy smell of rain-soaked ground. The wind whistled through the lot, bending the chain-link fence that bordered the forest. He scanned the area, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. Rows of stacked pallets and parked delivery trucks gleamed under the faint glow of the security lights. Then he saw it. At the tree line, just beyond the fence, the shadowy figure stood motionless. It was impossibly still, yet Tyler felt its gaze pressing on him, heavy and suffocating. "Hey, this is private property," Tyler called, his voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't respond. The security lights flickered, casting the lot into near darkness. Tyler's heart raced as his flashlight beam wavered. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. Back in his office, Tyler locked the door and stared at the monitors. He told himself it was just an animal, a trick of the shadows, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Then, just after midnight, the alarm chimed again. Tyler's stomach sank. Camera 4, which covered the employee entrance near the center of the lot, showed movement. Zooming in, he saw the figure again. It was closer now, standing just beyond the light's reach. Its body shifted unnaturally, as if it didn't quite belong in this world. Tyler grabbed the radio, but his voice caught in his throat. Who could he call? What could he say? The screen flickered, static distorting the image. For a brief moment, the figure seemed to turn its head, tilting it at an impossible angle. Then the camera went black. Tyler didn't want to go outside, but he couldn't stay in the office. The thought of being trapped there with that thing outside was worse. He grabbed his flashlight, his radio, and a wrench from the supply closet, anything to make him feel less vulnerable. The lot was eerily silent, the storm having passed. Rainwater pooled in the cracked asphalt, reflecting the dim glow of the security lights. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence pressed down on him. Then came the sound, a faint rustling from the woods, followed by a low guttural scrape, like nails dragging against metal. Tyler froze, his flashlight beam sweeping across the fence. The trees swayed gently, their rain-soaked branches glistening. Then the shadow moved. It stepped out from the tree line, its elongated limbs jerking unnaturally, like a marionette controlled by shaky hands. Tyler's breath caught as it moved closer, each step slow and deliberate. The figure had no face, no discernible features, yet Tyler felt its eyes boring into him. "Why do you run?" a voice whispered, soft and cold, carried by the wind. Tyler stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grasp. It hit the ground with a clatter, the beam spinning wildly before landing on the figure's feet. It was only a few yards away now. Tyler turned and bolted, his boots splashing through puddles as he sprinted back to the office. He slammed the door shut and locked it, collapsing into his chair. Tyler didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, gripping the wrench tightly, his eyes glued to the monitors. The shadow didn't appear again. When dawn finally broke, he stepped outside cautiously. The lot was empty, the forest silent. But as he walked toward his car, something caught his eye near the edge of the woods. Pressed into the muddy ground were footprints, long, deep, and inhuman. They led from the tree line to the lot and back again. Tyler quit the next day. He never returned to the warehouse, but sometimes, late at night, he thought about the shadow at the edge of the woods. He swore he could see it in his dreams, a flickering shape just out of reach. And sometimes when he looked out his window, he thought he saw it again, watching him from the dark.